2007 and 2008, there was a dramatic drop in the amount of sea ice we have seen in the Arctic. We don't know if that is a new direction. We think, unfortunately, it is, so that projections that only a few years ago said we would see sea ice perhaps disappearing in the summertime in maybe by the end of the century, people are now saying, including professors here at the University of Manitoba, saying that we could be out of sea ice in the summer in as few as 10 to 15 years. That has major implications for the biological processes in the Arctic, but it also actually works as an accelerator actually to ramp up climate change even more, because it is the ice and the snow that reflects the sunlight, and hence we don't warm as much. But if you take away the reflector, then you absorb more of the solar radiation, and by that process alone, this is what we call a positive feedback. It's an amplifier of the climate system and its warming. We also have in the Arctic, of course, the Greenland ice sheet. Most speculation a decade ago was, well, we don't worry about it, it'll be there for quite a while. Well, we're now concerned we could see, and we are seeing more dramatic melting of the Greenland ice sheet than we've ever seen, of course. It has been documented by satellites, by direct measurements of people out on the ice, that we're now seeing melt ponds on the surface, where the water is now running right to the bottom, to the landmass, which is typically several kilometers below, and then running out. And the drainage of the ice away from Greenland is happening at a much accelerated rate. The consequence of this is that the sea level rises. Sea level rises not because the Arctic floating ice is melting, because that's already floating, and hence you melt it, it doesn't actually change the sea ice. You can do that experiment with an ice cube in a glass of water. But if you melt the ice that is on land and add that water to the ocean, then you're adding more volume. You're also, as you warm the water, warm water expands. The ocean is like a big basin, and as you expand the water, the top goes up, which is sea level rise. Whereas we thought, as again, the projections of only a few years ago were perhaps a half meter or so of sea level rise. We're now talking probably more like a meter of sea level rise by the end of this century. If you melt Greenland entirely, which is entirely possible within a few centuries, or even less, a century, that corresponds to enough water when spread around the globe to be 6 to 7 meters of sea level rise. Well, that cottage that you just bought in Florida is now underwater. Prince Edward Island becomes, I think it's 4 or 5 islands. But more devastating in a global context is countries like, even with 1 meter of sea level rise, Bangladesh loses something like 10 or 15% of its landmass. That's tens of millions of people that are displaced from where they lived, where they grew and barely survived, but nonetheless did survive. Similarly, the Mekong Delta, again, millions of people. The major delta areas of the world and the mega cities of the world in Asia, the cities that are now or will be in the 10 to 20 to 30 million people, are mostly in coastal zones, and they're mostly in river deltas. They are being impacted in, let's say, multiple ways. The sea level is rising, so they're being impacted by the coast moving in towards them. As we get more intense rain events, the rivers are now flooding, so the water is coming at them that way. And the evidence is we are seeing more typhoons, as they call them in Asia, but we call them hurricanes. There have been, and there is expected to be more, not necessarily more hurricanes or typhoons. Typhoons, hurricanes are the same thing, just where you live, what you call them. And so as the sea warms up, it's the warmth of the energy from the ocean that drives the intense hurricanes. And we will see more Category 4 or 5 hurricanes, the ones with the intense precipitation, intense winds. And so if you're in the Florida regime, you'll see your coastal rising and more hurricanes. If you're in Southeast Asia, where there is huge numbers of people already more or less borderline in a sense because of the economic and social systems they are in. These people are going to be impacted with a triple, quadruple whammy of the sea level rising, more floods, more typhoons, and as well as that, with the hot days, we're getting into issues of diseases that we hadn't previously seen, because often it is humidity, moisture, and heat that generates viruses, bugs, mosquitoes in ways that we don't normally see. So climate change, which people like to say global warming, that sounds good to me, more sun-time weather, there will be that. There are some benefits. But overall, the consensus of the world scientific community is this is a devastating change to our planet that is happening because we choose not to do anything about our greenhouse gas emissions.